Got a gentleman on Zoom, no stranger to Shabbat Shalom, David Adler from the Australian Jewish Association. Following David Adler, I will be touching base with Vered Harel from the Australian Friends of Rambam. Lots of exciting news there. And in the second hour, I will be examining the facts from last week's interview with David Zyngier. But let me introduce my good friend again, David Adler from the Australian Jewish Association. David, welcome back to Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you a lot, Maurice, and great to be with you again, mate.
David, lots to talk about. The principal purpose of inviting you back on was to discuss this great article that that's been printed in the Spectator this week, written by you, and it has been printed in the Australian Spectator, UNRWA, where refugee services meet terrorism. You have written this great little article about the reduction of funding to UNRWA, which the AJA has been at the forefront of trying to address this wasteful situation. Take us through it.
Well, you're right, Maurice. It has been a priority for us. Maybe that in part is based on the medical principle of primum non nocere, which means firstly do no harm. And when you're giving money to organisations that either reward or incite terrorism, you're clearly doing harm. And this is actually the second major success that we've had in reforming Australia's foreign aid policy. In 2018, we succeeded after a very intense, multifaceted campaign to have Australia stop the cash grants to the Palestinian Authority because they were using money for the infamous, pay for slay program. But UNRWA has
lining their pockets.
For sure. UNRWA has been highly problematic because for some years it's been proven without a doubt that their educational content is not what we would normally regard as educational content in our schools, teaching kids to read and write and arithmetic. A lot of their educational content was about denial of the State of Israel, hatred of Jews, glorification of terrorism, heroes and heroines of the shahids, the martyrs in jihad. And we had about a dozen meetings during this year with members of parliament and senators, and we discussed Australia's money being used for this purpose and provided evidence, and it was very well received, but it came as a bit of a pleasant surprise to see that the adjustment had actually been made in our budget, and that the UNRWA funding has been reduced from Australia from $20 million to $10 million. Now, we would prefer zero, but clearly that is significant progress, and we need to thank all those involved for having achieved this result.
Kol hakavod, well done to you. And it is a sizable reduction, but doesn't go far enough. And the fact is that Australia we hear of a $1 trillion debt once we come out of COVID, and we have to borrow money to assist these parasites, excuse me, but I can't help but avoid that definition of them, especially when it goes to UNRWA. And as you say, they're embedded in the education system, which is one of hatred towards Israel, hatred towards Jews. And it's an education, well, actually I call it child abuse, but it's an education that is preparing them to join Hamas and become soldiers and fight against Israel at a very young age. I think at the age of 15, they take them in.
You're right. Hamas is very well integrated into the educational system of UNRWA. They control the teachers' union. They control the religious education. And the whole purpose is to get the kids into a mindset that enables them to be recruited for Hamas military purposes, terrorism purposes, and the UNRWA schools serve as a great recruiting ground for the paramilitary camps, the youth paramilitary camps that are run during the school holidays. Now, I should say that there's an argument made in the article, which can be accessed either on the AJA Facebook page, or if anyone wants to just Google Spectator magazine David Adler, they'll get the online version, and you can read a number of articles free of charge. You don't need to take a Spectator subscription. But what to do about it? What longer term solution is there other than cutting the money? And I argue that it's time for UNRWA to be disbanded. It is an organisation which is doing way more harm than good, but that doesn't mean abandoning people who are in genuine need. And those that are genuine refugees should be brought under the umbrella of what is otherwise the worldwide refugee organisation, even though it's not perfect, but the UN High Commission for Refugees is way better than UNRWA, and at least has a priority of resettling displaced people. So anyone who's displaced should be resettled, just as the Jews were resettled when there were Jewish refugees that came out of the 1948 conflict, and today we have 0 Jewish refugees. I mean, why is that? Because they either settled in Israel or they emigrated to other places like the US and England and some to Australia and were resettled. That's the way to solve issues involving refugees. But the only exception worldwide has been the so-called Arab Palestinian refugees that have gone on from generation to generation to generation, and it's clearly unsustainable and not working.
An absurdity, an absolute. And by the way, the Israelis, the Jews became refugees because they were kicked out of Arab countries.
Quite right.
750, 800,000, pack a bag and off you go, and Zama Gazint. And the blessing that there was in Israel there to take them in and make a new home. I printed off an article from an item from the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, launches a campaign against UNRWA as well, announced that Gilad Erdan announced that he will lead a campaign to expose the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, illegitimacy and its detrimental effect to peace. There's a whole article there. It's on the same wavelength, so it's a concerted effort from many different angles. You've taken, the HAA have taken on the job of getting Australia to open its nostrils and its eyes and see that UNRWA is nothing but a corporation. It's just a corporation with a lot of snouts in the trough, teaching a lot of hatred. But
the latter point's the really important point. I mean, you can find many international organisations that are corrupt and some people getting wealthy out of it, but they have raised now 2 generations who are committed to terrorism, who are committed to anti-Semitism. They have worked against the interests of peace and made it so much more difficult, and that's the compelling argument why a major change is now required.
Definitely, and it's also, there's an article on the front page of the Jewish News, the existence of the agency dedicated to sustaining generation after generation of Palestinians and the false belief that they are refugees from Israel and adults. So anyway, that's enough on that. David, you sent in an article to the Jewish News last week. It was somewhat edited. I read out the letter to the Jewish News in its entirety because I had the individual that was mentioned in that item, the letter, David Zyngier, as a guest. And you're mentioned in the Jewish News again. David Zyngier has responded. This time he wants to thank you. He cursed you. He COVID couldn't happen to a nicer guy, as we discussed, as I put it to him, and he denied saying that until I provided the written evidence to him. This time under the title Civilian Deaths. I want to thank David Adler for raising the issue of civilian deaths in the conflict between Israel and Palestine, AJN 9th of the 10th. According to the Jewish Virtual Library, since 1947, 4,145 Israelis have been killed as a result of terrorism, and between 17,762 and 21,580, there's a big gap there between, Palestinian civilians have been killed by Israeli forces. According to the figures from the International Media Information Centre, any media information centre has got to put a question mark over it, from, I reckon if you close down the media for a few weeks, the world would be a better place. From 2000, 10,012 Palestinians and 1,272 Israelis, including at least 2,172 Palestinian and 134 Israeli children were killed. Killing of the children and other non-combatants is outlawed by the Geneva Convention and must be the result of indiscriminate fire. The targeting of children would be a war crime. He goes on, and then he gets a free plug for himself. No mention of any of the wars. No mention of the 1948 war, the War of Extinction, 1967, War of Extinction, 1973, War of Extinction. No mention of the hostile environment that Israel is surrounded by. No mention of the fact that Gaza is controlled by Hamas, whose charter is the destruction of the state of Israel. It's a proxy. It's one of Iran's proxies of hatred. Has he apologised to you?
No. I actually think he needs to make a broader apology, Maurice. Look, I'm a big guy. Yes, he made a personal attack, saying that when we were diagnosed with coronavirus, and very mild case, but it became known publicly, couldn't happen to a nicer person. That's like water off a duck's back. But some of the statements that he's made, and even in the response, he's dug himself a bigger hole, I think. I mean, it's almost like saying that, well, because there haven't been as many Israelis killed as Arab Palestinians, maybe Israel is at fault, maybe there's something wrong with that. We all know that there is a complete difference in attitude on one side and the other. Israel invests in bomb shelters. It does everything it can to protect its citizens. On the other hand, we have Hamas leaders in particular advocating that their citizens should be human shields. And cartoonists have commented on this repeatedly. You'll see a cartoon of an Israeli soldier standing with a woman and child behind him, whereas there is an Arab terrorist with the woman and child in front. So that goes to some way in explaining the asymmetry in the casualties, but it's an entirely appropriate asymmetry in the circumstances. But the thing that he really needs to apologise for is, if you look at the original message that he put out, it is an allegation that Israel indiscriminately kills, including killing kids. Now, I'm not suggesting that David Zyngier is an anti-Semite, but when you use a phrase like indiscriminate killing of kids, that does seem very similar to some of the anti-Semitic blood libels that have been used in the past. And at a minimum, it is fodder for anti-Semites. So it does create a concern, and those sort of very poorly thought out criticisms of Israel. And in my view, unjustified criticisms of Israel. There is no military that takes more precautions to minimise civilian casualties. And obviously, any loss of life, particularly civilian life, is unfortunate, but in conflicts, it happens regrettably. But Israel goes to extraordinary lengths to minimise it, and this ongoing attack of Israel's record, I think, is of great concern, and that should be the basis of apology, not to me personally.
Well, that's because you're a mensch. And I'll just read something out. Michael Danby on Facebook. Zyngier should public apologise. Creepy to wish death on a couple because of political difference. All Green political party voters ought to be confronted with Zingier's behaviour. But you make the greater point that it's not a personal thing. Should be apologising for the assertion that Israel kills indiscriminately. Yes, we know that there is collateral damage. It's unavoidable when, as you just indicated, Hamas uses its civilian population as human shields, which is a war crime. It stores its cache of munitions amongst the civilian population, exactly. in the UNRWA schools, and knowing that there's likely casualties here, and you know, the harnessing of sympathy for them from the world. But yes,
and look,
they still hate Israel more than they love their children. You know, to quote Golda Meir, simple as that.
And Maurice, this is not personal at all. We've been sitting on screenshots that we've taken, and we've got others as well, and we were sitting on them some of them since late last year. But he decided to put his hand up for public office, to stand in an election as a Greens candidate for a political role, and then it becomes a matter of public interest. And that's why we took the decision to expose it at this time, say these are the statements that have been made, and people need the information and they can form their own judgments based on the actual statements and
the character.
Yeah, and you've got the copies of the screenshots, as have a few other people.
Definitely. And Dave, we've only got a few more minutes. Oh, I've got 5 minutes.
Sure.
Another item that I want to mention that is in this week's Jewish news, the Australian Jewish news, leadership Sturm. In 2018, when Qatar's Australian Party Senator Fraser Anning used the phrase final solution, notwithstanding it was not used in the context of the Holocaust, the Jewish community, Jewish media and the left-wing mainstream media went ballistic, apoplectic actually. Particularly vocal was the Anti-Defamation Commission's ADC, David Zyngier. It was revealed on the Sky News program Outsiders on Sunday in Parliament. Newly appointed Greens Aboriginal Senator Lidia Thorpe used the very same term, final solution. Similarly, not in the context of Jewish Holocaust, but in relation to her Aboriginal ancestors. However, interestingly, the ADC's Mr. Abramovich and the Jewish community appear to be all Sturm. No media statements, TV or radio interviews condemning Senator Thorpe and what I consider her extremist Greens party for using the same vitriolic language and used against Senator Anning, turning the page for invoking the very same phase as Thorpe. It will be interesting to hear the Jewish communal spin on why the two identical incidents have been treated so differently. Michael Bird, Toorak, Victoria.
Yeah, well, it's a very powerful question and a very relevant question. I mean, obviously we don't support the use of the term final solution because it does create a great deal of pain, particularly for those associated with the Holocaust or descendants of Holocaust survivors. But it is a curiosity, to put it mildly, that one senator was publicly vilified, not only by our community, but there was a censure motion passed in the Senate by Labour Liberals, whereas another senator who uses exactly the same phrase, and there's no reaction. Now, we found the interview that Lidia Thorpe, the new Greens Senator from Victoria, gave where she used the term final solution. So we have the transcript. And again, it wasn't in association with the Holocaust. It was in association with some Aboriginal issue. But the contrast is very dramatic. Now, I did meet Fraser Anning. His choice of words was extremely poor, and we said so publicly, but he wasn't an anti-Semite. In fact, he did some things when he was in the Senate we would regard as supportive of Israel and supportive of the Jewish community. That's not to condone his use of the term, but just to confirm that it was an extremely poor choice of words, but the context in which both of the senators were using it was not Holocaust related. And in fact, there have been at least another dozen examples by parliamentarians. You can do a search in the Hansard records, and I think even Michael Danby once used it in relation to a submarine contract many years ago, and clearly not related to the Holocaust, just a poor choice of words.
Poor choice of words. Fraser Anning was a guest on Shabbat Shalom, and I found him to be very supportive of the Jewish community in Israel.
Michael Bird's point is absolutely correct.
Yeah.
Double
standards.
Why does one senator get vilified and the other gets a free pass?
Yeah, but it's typical these days. David, another great Zoom event last Wednesday with Juliet Moss, a spokesperson for the Jewish Council in New Zealand, discussing the upcoming event and political perspectives of the different parties there, whether supportive towards Israel. That's, I guess, our listeners can check that out on the AJA YouTube page, the website and Facebook page. We've got another outstanding guest coming up this Wednesday. Can't wait. It's a bit of a firebrand. I love him. Mordechai Kedar.
Yeah, Mordechai Kedar is nothing short of a superstar.
Yeah.
If anyone hasn't seen his skills, because he's a fluent Arabic speaker, and he will go on to Al Jazeera and debate in defence of Israel. So, I mean, you can go onto YouTube, put in Mordechai Kedar, Al Jazeera, and come up with a few examples of videos there. So we're very much looking forward to having him because he's an expert on Arabic and Islamic matters. We'll be talking about the implications of the recent peace deals. What does it mean, not just for the UAE and Bahrain, but for the rest of the Arab Muslim world? What does it mean for the Palestinian Authority and Hamas? What are the implications for Israel, generally positive, negative, whatever. So he is a very well-grounded expert in such matters, and we'll hopefully get an uncensored insight into the implications of these deals.
When he's on Al Jazeera, he doesn't hold back. He doesn't hold back. I look forward to that, David. And that's on at 8 p.m. this Wednesday night. All the information's on the Facebook page and the AJA webpage. David, I want to thank you again for your generous time and wealth of information, and Kol Hakavod on the AJA for achieving some wonderful results, with the cessation of funding to the Palestinian Authority, and what appears to be a 50% reduction in the funding towards UNRWA. Keep working. Let's keep that other 10 million. I'm sure there's plenty of Victorians that can do with the assistance of $10 million, especially with our government here.
Well, that's one of the purpose for the Spectator article, to keep the issue on the boil, to take it to the next stage as much as we can.
Terrific. David, Kol Hakavod, keep up your great work, and see you at the Zoom on Wednesday.
Thanks, Maurice.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. David Adler, President of the Australian Jewish Association, the most proactive organisation in Australia. And full disclosure, I am a member of the Australian Jewish Association